This is Question of the Week from BU Today.
Hi, I'm Gemma Champong, and this week on the podcast, I'm asking the question, why do so many autistic girls go undiagnosed? But before we get into that, I want to share my own story and the rabbit hole that led me to propose this podcast. Like many before the pandemic, I was not an avid TikTok user, but boredom from continuous quarantines and a brief yet stressful stint of unemployment found me scrolling through, trying to use the app enough so that the magical algorithm would somehow ensure I'd be constantly entertained, and entertained I was. But as time went on, I noticed that my For You page, a page of videos suggested by TikTok's algorithm, started filling up with anecdotes from autistic women who shared their experiences growing up and the challenges they faced in adulthood. Some were funny.
You're autistic? Everyone's a little autistic. Oh, you're 6 feet tall? Well, everyone's a little 6 feet tall. Though you're 5'4".
While others were sobering, as these women shared their difficulty adapting to a society largely designed for the neurotypical mind.
To other people, it seems like social interactions are really easy for me, but no, it's terribly hard. I'm just good at making it seem comfortable for someone else, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it is a survival mechanism and a coping strategy I've used.
These voices seem to fall into a few camps: those who have been diagnosed as children, those diagnosed as adults, and those struggling to figure out if they should seek out their own diagnoses. And as time went on, I found myself identifying with that latter group and began to ask the question many on the app were asking: why did it seem like women were being diagnosed later in life, or not getting diagnosed at all in comparison to men? After my deep dive of what I'll call TikTok research, I turned to my next best source for information: Google. I found that the criteria for diagnosing autism spectrum disorder, ASD, are based on data derived almost entirely from studies of boys. I also learned that the disorder is thought to be at least 4 times more common in boys than girls, and many girls are diagnosed later in childhood because their symptoms diverge from stereotypical autistic behavior. However, there are limits to the everyday Googling and curiosity. For one, published research is often dense and written with other researchers and scientists in mind. I knew that in order to answer my question, I need to talk to researchers directly for the full picture. So, I reached out to 2 BU researchers working directly in the autism field: Gael Orsmond, the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs for Sargent, BU's College of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences, and PhD student Sharada Krishnan. Their current study, called the Road Ahead Study, focuses on high school students on the autism spectrum who plan to graduate high school with a regular high school diploma. The study isn't focused on female high school students specifically, but having worked with a subset of autistic teens for years, I thought they might have some interesting perspectives on why this diagnostic difference seems to be ever present. And as you'll hear later on, TikTok and I weren't too far off. First of all, I'd like to say thanks for joining me on this podcast episode. To start, can you guys tell me a bit about yourselves and an overview of autism?
I'm Gael Orsmond. I'm a professor of occupational therapy here at Sargent College. I'm a clinical and developmental psychologist by training. I've been doing research focused on autism for the past 20 plus years.
Hi, I'm Sharada Krishnan. I also go by Shar. I am a PhD student in Dr. Orsmond's lab. My background is in occupational therapy, and I worked on a neuroimaging study with autistic children and adolescents, and now moving more into the adolescent space to do work on Gail's study.
Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. There are probably multiple causes, we believe. There are hypotheses about environmental factors, and probably most likely it's a combination of environment and kind of genetics interacting that tend to cause autism. That question has been out there since I started autism research, which was 25 years ago, and it's amazing that we don't know more yet. It can affect all aspects of one's life, but since it's a spectrum, individuals experience different effects depending upon their strengths and their specific challenges. The autism spectrum disorder is diagnosed according to criteria by the DSM-V, so that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, published by the American Psychiatric Association. And there are 2 primary areas where we see impairments for a person to be diagnosed with autism. One is in social communication and interaction. So that can include challenges with social emotional reciprocity, things like having a back and forth conversation. There can also be impairments in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction. So things like eye contact or not using as many gestures or as much facial expression to facilitate that communication and social interaction. And then difficulties in developing and maintaining and understanding relationship. And then the second primary area is about repetitive and focused behaviors and interests. And this, again, can range from repetitive motor movement, can include things like an insistence on sameness or distress at small changes in one's environment or routine. It can include interests that are atypical in their intensity or their focus, and it can also include sensory challenges. The behaviors have to be present from a young age and impact the person's everyday life.
In addition to all of that, we know from research that autistic people often have differences in their executive functioning abilities, so the ability to plan and organize and these sort of higher order cognitive skills. And some of them might also have challenges with daily living skills.
I think it's interesting you said that it has to have an impact on their lives. Would you say if it's not having a huge impact, it probably wouldn't register on the autism spectrum?
All the behaviors that I mentioned that are part of that criteria occur in the general population. So that's the challenge, right? There's a spectrum, and for a diagnosis, you have to have a line somewhere. For example, there's variability in eye contact among people in the general population, and some of that's even cultural. Some of us have more or less facial expression. Some of us want more or less social interaction. And then many of us have hobbies that are, similar in content to some of the interests in people with autism. But for the diagnosis, it has to be something that's really kind of impacting their life, or there's more intensity to their interests than in the general population. So for a diagnosis, you really need a combination of these symptoms or behaviors to kind of meet the threshold. In general, the gold standard for diagnosis is an assessment called the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, and it's an interactive assessment where the clinician rates the behaviors of the person according to specific criteria. That's generally the route that someone would go through to get a formal diagnosis.
I've heard of the term masking or camouflaging in reference to autism. Can you speak more about what that might be and what that entails?
So masking is essentially when a neurodiverse person hides or camouflages those traits and replaces them with behaviors that might appear more neurotypical. So it's kind of covering up their autistic traits in a sense. So an example of this might be that an autistic person is having a challenge understanding the intention of the person talking to them. Maybe they don't understand the tone of that person's voice, but they are smiling through it because they don't want to necessarily appear confused. We also know from research that it might be that females are more able to mask their autistic signs than males.
Is there any indication in the research why that might be? Do you think it's a nature thing, a nurture sort of thing?
So the criteria for autism are the same for boys and girls, but historically we've seen that autism is diagnosed 3 to 4 times more often in boys than girls. But in children with autism who have intellectual disability, the ratio is more like 2 boys to every 1 girl. And we also know that girls with autism who do not have intellectual disability tend to be diagnosed later. And there's debate in the field about whether these differences in rates between boys and girls are accurate. More from a genetic or biological perspective, it's possible that there's sort of a protective effect of being female, and that would suggest that these rates are accurate and that females are just less likely to develop autism symptoms due to kind of genetic or biological factors. And then, as Shar mentioned, kind of the other possibility is that autism is underdiagnosed in girls because they express autism in a way that doesn't align with the diagnostic criteria. So these criteria were developed primarily based on boys, and girls with autism may be better able to kind of mimic or copy the expected social behaviors. Their interests might be more age and gender appropriate, so like focused interests in dolls or pop stars. And so it doesn't seem quite so unusual to the people around them. And so the debate is really still out. We don't know what the truth is, and there's quite a bit of research going on about the gender differences.
And it could also be partly a societal expectation of women. Like we sort of expect that women have more pressure to fit in, and we have these gendered expectations for social behavior. So that could also be playing into it.
Your current research is focused on teens with autism and the difficulties they may face in their transition into adulthood. Can you speak more about the research you two are specifically doing and how that's progressing?
For the past 5 years, we've been conducting the Road Ahead study, which is funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Educational Sciences. Road Ahead stands for Responsibilities of Adulthood. So we're interested in how autistic youth learn to manage the responsibilities of adulthood as they transition and how schools provide services to these youth. So we've been studying high school students who are graduating with a regular high school diploma. Diploma track autistic students are those who are more likely to go on to college, and we were interested in finding out what types of services they received in high school and how that prepared them for adulthood. We've recruited a sample of about 40 youth who participated prior to graduation and then a year after graduation. One of the things Shar and I have been doing recently is working on a new way to think about how to measure the adult outcomes. Overall, we found that these young adults are doing quite well when we look at the outcomes in a way that both captures objective and subjective indicators. For example, they're going to college, working full-time, or they're in a transition program. They're largely satisfied with their social life. They have fairly high levels of autonomy in their living situation, even if they're still living at home.
It's important to not only look at these objective measures of researcher-defined values, but also what autistic youth want for themselves and whether they are happy and satisfied in whatever they are doing, especially in terms of living situation. Previous research has kind of categorized that as youth are doing well if they're living away from home in the year after they graduate from high school. But even if you think about a neurotypical student, a lot of them live at home after graduation, or they may not be employed because they are in a post-secondary education program. So we need to rethink what is developmentally appropriate for this population. We've been doing some work looking at gender differences in how youth are achieving both of these objective and subjective outcomes. And really what we found is there are not a whole lot of differences in gender. Granted, we do have a very small sample size of females, and I think that in itself is indicative of sort of this gender difference in autism diagnosis as a whole. So we do have smaller number of females in our sample, but they really aren't doing all that different. One thing that is noticeable, however, is that females do appear to have less autonomy in their daily life than males do. And that, again, could go back to societal expectations of how we raise females versus how we raise males.
Do you think you'll be doing more later on to see how they do after college, or?
I think that's a great question. Currently, we don't have funding to follow them beyond this time point. The grant was from the Department of Education, so they're really interested in what schools are doing to prepare the youth. In a prior study that I worked on with some mentors from University of Wisconsin and Brandeis, we followed families for 12 years. And so there is quite a bit of data out there, but some of that data is kind of old now, or it looks at outcomes across a range of ages, so 22 to 60. And so what we're really trying to do in this current project is focus specifically on young adulthood and contextualize those outcomes.
Does your study take into account not only what the school is doing, but also the home living situation and what the parents might be doing?
So in that prior study that I mentioned, the focus was on the family. In this current study, it's been on the school, given the funding source. But we do have other research going on in our lab about how adult siblings support their family member on the autism spectrum and work with their families to plan for the future. So that family focus is definitely something that we have done in other projects.
I've seen the terms high functioning and low functioning used sometimes when people reference or talk about people with autism, and the conversation and nuances about neurodiversity and acceptance and what is more accepting terms have changed. How do you feel as a researcher about how those terms are used?
So that's always a challenge. As you mentioned, we started the Road Ahead study more than 5 years ago. And at that time, people were using the terms. Over the past 5 years, we've really come to realize that some people don't like those terms and they don't like being referred to as low functioning. Also, that wording is really not very specific. So low functioning meaning what? And so I try to be more specific in the language that I use, such as a person who has nonverbal autism, or they don't speak, or they have intellectual disability. There was also a study in 2016 by Kenny and colleagues, and they looked at which stakeholders preferred which terminology. And since then, I think a lot of people are really trying to be more respectful and thoughtful about the terms they use. We are tending to use more identity first language, so autistic person. Or on the spectrum, we try to avoid using words like disorder or deficit, and we try to take a strength-based approach.
I think there's a key distinction to be made between disorder and disability, because disorder implies that there's something inherently wrong with the person. Whereas a disability, if you look at the disability rights movement and that community, they view it as a person has a disability because the environment is not built or made to match their needs and their support needs. And so really, to alleviate disability, what we need to be thinking about as a society is how to build society in a way that works for all people. And so autistic people, I think by and large, there is a consensus that autism is a disability, but it's because society is set up in a way that doesn't meet their needs.
You've talked about this before, about the differences you noticed in your research between girls and boys, and that there's probably not that much difference aside from that girls might have a little bit less autonomy. Are there any other differences?
When we just looked at the differences between young women and young men in our sample, they're going to college or working at kind of the same rates. They are satisfied with their social lives at about the same rates. That's really about it. I know from our prior research where we interviewed educators and family members, we've heard a little bit about what Shar was mentioning in terms of the differences in perhaps how parents parent their child with autism. So parents of young women will talk about their concerns over their daughter's vulnerability. So there's some differences there. Parents, when they talk about their autistic children, are talking about their children. Parents of young women are concerned about their daughter's sexual behavior, for example. And parents of young men have often talked to us about their concerns about their son having encounters with police because of their behaviors. And so some of those are gendered kind of expectations and concerns. And we definitely see that in our research as well.
I think it says more about what's happening in society and kind of how we view men versus women in general. Like, I wouldn't say that's an autistic thing. I'd say in general, women are and young girls are treated and raised a bit differently than young boys. It's interesting that you noticed that in your research, because hearing that, I'd say, oh, wow, that just says more about kind of society versus autism. I think you mentioned this much earlier, just how much more research needs to be done in regards to these differences and to understand more about the difference between diagnosing genders.
There was a study, and it showed actually that when you compared clinician ratings of autism symptoms to self-reported autism symptoms, clinicians tended to underrate symptoms as compared to the actual autistic female individuals themselves. And I think it does sort of show that we really need to understand more about how females present and maybe the nuances and masking and how that contributes potentially to diagnostic differences.
And in the literature, there are also quite a few articles written by autistic women who talk about camouflaging and the emotional stress of having to always present yourself in a way that doesn't feel natural to how you typically operate. You know, we need to do more research, but that research is really challenging to do.
Building off of that, we know from these anecdotal qualitative studies that autistic females who are diagnosed later in life, they often report feeling profoundly different from their peers. And so getting that diagnosis can be extremely validating and give them a sense of self-identity. So there are definitely benefits to getting a diagnosis, even if it is later in life.
I was also going to add that we're talking about male and females, and there's quite a bit of research in the autism field also looking at non-binary identification, and the rates seem to be higher than in the general population. Even when we look at gender outcomes in our study, we need to be mindful of what we're really looking at.
There's talk about a revision to the DSM-V, which is a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders for those who aren't aware. It will be released sometime in March, which is the month we're recording in. And the talk that I've seen about it online and on social media has been about concern with the new conservative criteria. Do you think you'll see those effects or changes in your research down the line?
So when we're doing research, we have to have a fairly narrow definition of autism and who we include in our studies. And that's in part to compare studies and in part because those are the expectations for grant funders and publishers of research. So I don't think it'll affect research. It could affect kind of the prevalence rates in the general population, as you mentioned. But I think there's always going to be questions about that. We've been changing our criteria for the past 20 years, and we keep trying to get it right. And given it's a spectrum, you have to draw a line somewhere about where it becomes a condition or a disability, and where to draw that line is the hard part.
I'd like to thank you both for talking to me about this. It's something I've been very interested in because of social media and because of my own personal life. So it's good to talk to researchers who are working with autism and getting a broader picture of what is actually happening in the field.
Thanks, Gemma. It's been nice talking with you as well.
Thanks to Gael, Orsmond, and Sharada Krishnan for joining us on this episode of Question of the Week. This episode was edited by Doug Most, engineered by Andy Halleck, produced by Dana Ferrante, and hosted by me, Gemma Champong. Thanks for listening, and see you in 2 weeks.